Today, we live in a world of globalized trade and constant contact between nations. As we are well aware of at this point, globalization in international relationships has its positives and negatives. But let's remember, this globalized world is a stark contrast to the world that existed prior to and even during the early stages of civilization, where groups of people spread throughout the world had zero contact with people in other societies. However, as civilization began to prosper, the chances of staying isolated began to shrink, while the ambitions of rulers trying to expand their empires began to grow. The Fertile Crescent was not only growing, it was prospering. As both Egypt and Mesopotamia continued to thrive, the ambitions of both civilizations increased, and the desire to expand power began to take shape. Much of this expansion began to occur at and around the halfway point of each civilization's history, about 2300 BCE. As we learned before, both ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia were initially established as separated cities spread throughout their respective territories. After each city was able to establish themselves and successfully create strong societies, leaders of those cities began to looking outwards in the hopes of expanding their power and resources. Credit for establishing the first empire in world history is given to Mesopotamian ruler Sargon of Akkad. Ruler of the city of Akkad, Sargon expanded his power beyond his city by invading the city of Sumer and eventually expanded his power across the entire region of Mesopotamia. The Akkadian Empire only lasted about 200 years, and following Sargon and eventually his predecessor's expansion, nomadic warriors known as the Amorites invaded Mesopotamia and overthrew the Akkadian Empire, establishing the Kingdom of Babylon. Eventually, Hammurabi would lead Babylon to even further greatness. Remember him? Meanwhile, in Egypt, the same concept of uniting all city-states began to take shape. As was the case in early Mesopotamia, early pre-dynastic Egypt consisted of numerous villages and larger cities operating independently. However, by approximately 3200 BCE, two kingdoms were established, one kingdom in Lower Egypt and the other in Upper Egypt. Eventually, both kingdoms would be united. While not exactly certain, this unification is believed to have occurred under King Narmer and occurred around 3000 BCE. This unified kingdom of Egypt became the first of 31 dynasties that lasted over the course of about 2600 years. Now, as had become the case in Mesopotamia, Egypt successfully transformed from independent cities into a unified kingdom. After becoming a unified kingdom, Egypt began to expand its wealth through the use of international trade. It is important to note that some trade had already been established between the independent cities of Mesopotamia and Egypt on a much smaller scale. Some of that trade has actually been attributed to the influence both regions may have had on the other. However, after both regions consolidated power and established empires, trade now became a necessary tool in maintaining and expanding that power. During the early dynastic period, Egyptian sailing had opened the door for increased international trade with Mesopotamia and other areas throughout the region, further expanding as their technology improved. This increased trading and expansion of wealth only served to increase the kingdom's prosperity. Of course, this was not done without a fair amount of warfare as well. Nevertheless, by the end of the New Kingdom era in Egypt, the kingdom had expanded its borders and increased the number of trading outposts throughout the region. The question becomes, what does this all mean? Well, it was from this point forward in ancient times that territorial expansion, global trade, and competing empires had begun. The world of hunting and gathering we shared only centuries before would become forgotten, with only a few remaining exceptions in the world. The world was beginning to shrink as more and more civilizations began encountering one another. The stage was now set for a world history filled with international trade, cooperation, and of course, conflict. So as we deal with our current situation, let us not forget that we live in a global community that began thousands of years ago, and provides us with many of the benefits as well as some of the problems we have to deal with in our current lives. All we can do is continue to improve what began thousands of years ago, learning from the mistakes of the past while preparing for the future.